We've got some awesome new Gear Chronicle support to go over, so let's jump right into this video.
Stand up! Vanguard!
Hey card fighters, welcome back to another card review update video, and today we've got some awesome new support cards in the form of these new right chain for Link Joker, and it's the Schwarzschild Gravity Core or Collapse, or the Gravity cards, Dragons, the Cyber Dragons in general, and they are really looking awesome, and I'm very hyped and stoked for these cards, as soon as I wanted to play these cards in the past, but as soon as I played during midway the G era that I started playing Vanguard, these cards were basically trash at that point and you couldn't use them in any real sense. So that was a little bit bummer, but now with the reboot I got another chance, another shot at playing these cards, and they are looking very interesting in general with these new cards effects and how they interact. But enough jib jabbing for me, let's just jump right into these cards and see how they might impact the gameplay for Link Joker, or just the upcoming meta of Violence Deleter in general. So first off, we've got the starter, the Great Zero, and that is Micro Hole Drago Kit. It's just your usual when rolled upon draw a card, and it's not really special. It's a little bit odd, as seen as deleters might not really get a lot of cards in total with this set. But we now have two of the starters. We have one in the trial deck that's the deleter, and now we have this one. So I don't know what it might entice for the overall support quality of Link Joker, but it's still neat little art card that we can run as a starter. But now we're getting to the actual meat of this thing, and that is the Great One, and that's Gravity Ball Dragon. And his skill is continuous rearguard circle. During your turn, if your opponent has 2 or less rearguards, all of your other Cyber Dragons in the same row as its unit get power plus 4k. And this card is very interesting in a way that it boosts an entire row instead of usual columns. And we have seen this before with the Neo Nectar card that also gives plant tokens in the same row a lot of power. But this one does it for Cyber Dragons. And this right chain itself are Cyber Dragons, but Link Joker does have access to Cyber Dragons in the past with other cards. And I believe mostly Great Freeze, but you can put this thing in the front row with a Force Marker and it still works fine with that. So it can have a lot of potential. But the most impact of the card comes from the fact that if you clear out the field quite effectively, and you have this thing in the back row, a completely filled back row with this card alone, then each version of this card becomes a 16k booster. Combine it with the fact that it's a Force Clan, so there's probably Force Marker in that same row, so that's a 26k, and it's probably is boosting a grade 2 or higher, so that's another 10k at least, so that becomes a 36k, and it might be on the deleted Vanguard, so that's 36 against 0. And then you can see that this is quite strong, and it can be very dangerous in the right conditions. So I'm very curious of, with all the other cards, how good it might interact. And there is a lot of potential in this card, and it can do a lot of mean harm against your opponent in the right conditions. So awesome card. But now we're getting to the actual very interesting cards in the set, and that's the Grade 2 and the Grade 3. And first we're going to go over the Grade 2, and that's Gravity Collapse Dragon. And his skill is auto on Vanguard to rearguard circle. When an attack hits a Vanguard, look at the 5 cards from the top of your deck, write or call up to 1 Grade 3 Cyber Dragon from among them to the circle this unit is on as rest, and shuffle your deck. So basically what it does, it calls another one on top of it in rest if you are lucky in the top 5. At first I didn't think much about the skill, as on a rearguard circle it's like, why would you do it, as seen as you're minusing an interceptor. But then you look at it from the Vanguard's point of view, and then it becomes a very strong card in the right conditions, as when you went second against any kind of deck, and especially against Axel that's gonna hammer a lot, they need to take advantage of the point that they are still stronger than you when you're not at your Grade 3 turn if they went first. Now you can just deny them that in that regard. If you're gonna hit them and they were still Grade 2 and you hit this thing off, you are now at the 13k base. So next turn they are 12k and they are not strong enough. Now switch that around and think, when you went first, you can potentially be a 13k base when they are going into the Grade 2 turn. And it's even strong against Force, as soon as they are not hitting you anymore and they need to dedicate more cards in the field instead of less cards than they were planning. And that can be very powerful in the right conditions. But there's another thing this card makes it even better, is the fact that most Cyber Dragon Grade 3s, and I think you have another one in the trial deck that's also Cyber Dragon to support Grade 3, have Force Markers. So if you still have a standing rearguard, you can use this skill, get a Force Marker, put it underneath that rear guard that's still standing, and then have an increase of a 10k bump on that unit. And even in the case that you hit them and they got a defensive trigger, well, your force marker just nullified the defensive trigger. So even in the most optimal situation for your opponent, it still doesn't do that much, as seen as the force marker denies them any kind of defensive play. So that makes this card very strong under the right condition, and might see actual play if the grade 3 Cyber Dragons are any good. And since this card isn't necessary from the rest of the right change, you can run this thing separate from the rest if they don't interact it well with the other cards. So very awesome card indeed. Let's go to the grade 3, and this is the reason why I make the joke that it's a Gear Chronicle support card, and that's because of Schwarzschild Dragon. And he has 2 skills, and the first one is Act Vanguard Circle, once per turn, cost, counter +1, choose one of your opponent's rear guards and bind it face down. We have already seen this skill in many times before with the deleters in the trial deck and whatsoever. Interesting effect, it's a pretty okay effect. And the binding face down, we already seen some merit in the trial deck that some units get a power bump with it, but not that much, and it doesn't really do that much for us. So it's still a little bit, why do we do it? But then we're going into this card and look at the second skill, and then we suddenly see, that's why we're binding cards face down. As seen as his second skill is Act on Vanguard Circle, cost, counter +1, soul +1 grade 3, and turn all cards in your opponent's bind zone face up. Your opponent cannot normal call cards with the same card name as face up cards in his or her bind zone until the end of his or her turn. Count the cards bound after this. So basically what it does, when you use the skill, flip everything in their bind zone face up, and then all the cards that are faced up in their bind zone, they cannot call them normally to the Guardian Circle or their Rear Guard Circle until the end of their next turn. And that is very interesting, but also very powerful under the right conditions. I know that everything is under the right conditions, but that's basically everything with Vanguard. But the fact with this card is that it has 2 sides to it. It has a guard restriction, but also just a play restriction. And the guard restriction itself is pretty terrible, as seen as most guard restrictions either say you cannot guard with grade 1s, grade 2s, grade 0s, or sentinels, or a mix of the 2, and they just eliminated a pretty significant size of amount of cards. But this card doesn't do that. This card eliminates specific cards and only copies of that card. And it's seen already 1 of them are in the bind zone, means there are only 3 copies at most left in the deck, if any are still left, if they run more copies of the card or they already used them up. So that's a little bit limited. But the power of this card comes in the fact that they also cannot call those cards until the next turn. So if you bound a lot of their grade 1s and 2s or their key cards, they can have no access to that card at all if they cannot use any superior calling effect. So some clans that do not have access to that are pretty screwed in their plays next turn. So in that regard, it's somewhat of a lock mechanic, but in a more dynamic kind of gameplay, as seen as your opponent can play around it. As said before, the guard restriction isn't really that strong, but what's awesome about it is the fact that you as a player can counterplay it. You know what's already in your bind zone, and you as a player can then anticipate, alright, they can have access to this card, so I'm gonna decide to guard or use those cards early on, so I can either place them on the field early or guard with them whenever I can to save up other guard options when this card comes in effect. So you have a way to counterplay this in an interactive way, and that is something that I really like, that you have restrictions or guard restriction or play restrictions, but still in a somewhat interactive kind of way, as soon as you can basically prepare for this card. And as stated before, they flip everything face up. So that's an okay thing for Gear Chronicle, as it helps with us with the total grades of binding face up cards. But then again, all cards are counted that are in the bind zone face up. So also the cards that we as Gear Chronicle players have bound ourselves. So depending on what it is, we can even be screwed even harder. But in most cases, when things are going the way that we are planning, the cards that we bound ourselves are probably grade 3s or grade 4s that have no shield value at all, and the cards that we're probably not going to call. Also, we have a lot of superior call effects, so that might not hurt us that much. And as stated before, Gear Chronicle cycles a lot for the deck, so we can use those cards that are already in the bind zone, use them early on to negate any form of pressure this card can have against us. But still, it gives a neat little interaction gameplay than just restrictive guard restriction or lock in general, as lock is just a very toxic game mechanic for a game like Vanguard, as seen as it just denies you any kind of play. Even Zanbaku in regard that just locks your opponent an entire turn of doing anything is also not really that healthy for a game as Vanguard, where it's all about interacting with your opponent, and just removing that part of the game isn't always that great. And this does that, but it does it in a correct way, in my honest opinion, as seen as it doesn't just generically blocks out anything and they cannot do about it. No, it's something that takes, it's going to be built up over time, and your opponent can interact with it before it happens. So they have a say in the matter before it's just completely removed from them. And that is something I really want to see. And we are also seeing that in a form with Shiroyuki, and I'm going to cover tomorrow, that also has this kind of interactive gameplay with your opponent, and they can still interact with it in the kind of way that it's not restrictive to them. It is a really, really awesome kind of addition to the game that brings some restriction to either your opponent or you, but in an interactive way that you can either play around it, play against it, prepare for it, or in some regards still plan for it ahead, that it might not be always that destructive or that oppressive, that it's just always going to go off like something like a Zanbaku that might hurt some clans always and they have no say in the matter, or they have no out. But as a Chronicle player, I'm very hyped for this support, as seen as we now have 3 support waves in a row. And if you're wondering what I'm talking about, we got the one in Answer Truth, that was our own Gear Chronicle support. Then the booster after that, Miyachi Academy, we got Narukami. And it seems Narukami is doing pretty well, and Narukami is one of our best matchups. That's also really positive for us. And now we've got this card, and depending if this card is going to perform very well in the upcoming meta, that might be even better for us Gear Chronicle players, as seen as we got a lot of good matchups then. So I'm very hyped for that, but all jokes aside, as stated before, especially the grade 2 and the grade 3 are looking really awesome, and this new interactive kind of gameplay that helps making the game more dynamic and more fun is very awesome, and I hope we're going to see that a lot more. And as stated before, Shiryuki is one of those cards that helps it, also helps that, and I'm going to cover those cards tomorrow because I didn't really have the time to do that. So if you're interested in my opinion and how the cards work and they might interact with other cards, stay tuned tomorrow when I go over those cards. But there's still also a lot of other cards that still need to be revealed. And it seems it's probably around only 2 weeks before the Japanese format are going to get these cards. We're going to get a lot of new super reveals very soon in the upcoming couple of days. So if you're interested in any kind of updates about the new cards, how they might interact and basically be used in the upcoming meta, then why not subscribe to the channel, as I'm going to cover all these new cards as they come out. And yeah, as always guys, I'm Mr. Timeep, and see you guys in the next one.